let's switch gears here and talk about Montreal's heritage with Peter Trent, longtime former mayor of Westmount. 5 terms, in fact. He's on the line. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
It's great to talk to you. Do I go with Mr. Trent, former Mayor Trent? What should I say, Peter?
Well, just don't say old Mr. Trent. Old Mayor Mr. Trent, or whatever. Just call me Peter. That's my name.
So, Peter, listen, I took great attention to your latest column in the Montreal Gazette. Headline is this: Today's architectural fashions must not demolish Montreal's heritage. And then you go into some great detail. It seems like it is a bit hit and miss. We do some good, we do some bad when it comes to protecting Montreal's heritage. Why don't you tell us a bit more?
Well, one of my points in that article was that Old Montreal has been preserved since 1964. And by the way, thanks to a couple of Anglophones, it got that designation. But the so-called Golden Square Mile, I think golden is a bit tacky. I just call it the Square Mile. Yeah. But the Square Mile, which of course was essentially Anglo with a couple of exceptions, never got any protection. And so this is how, indeed, the Van Horn Mansion was demolished. When the developer asked for it, they had no laws to stop them from giving a demolition permit. So the Square Mile, which is, as I said, was essentially Anglo, has never been preserved. There's a few buildings within it that now, a little bit late, have received some certification on the part of the Quebec government. But that's about it, really. So Old Montreal was protected from 1964 on, and the Square Mile has not been. A little interesting part about Old Montreal, Mayor Drapeau at the time, you may recall, you weren't there maybe, anyway, you may have read,
yeah.
Was involved, of course, in the creation of Expo and everything else. But he felt that Old Montreal should be protected because it was more French. Now, it's true that the majority of people who live in Old Montreal, and by the way, there's only about 10,000 that live there, are French. But the point being is that there's very little in the way of French construction in Old Montreal that dates to the period when France owned La Nouvelle France. And indeed, just about all the buildings, with the exception of maybe 6, were built by the British. So Old Montreal is not as French as I think Monsieur Drapeau thought it was. And indeed, ironically, it was essentially all built by the British. So you have the Square Mile built by the British, you have the Old Montreal built by the British. I thought it was rather interesting given the current debate taking place with Legault, and I think it's important to point out Legault is not the first time that Quebec has essentially ignored the history of the English in Quebec.
That's the thing, right, Peter? And I think you're spot on that some people like to think that English just showed up to Quebec 2 decades ago or 4 decades ago.
Yeah,
and that's just not the case. It's the history of this province is so intertwined with the history of that Anglophone community and of course the British that came here so long ago. Now, Peter, what's the right mix? What's the balance? Because I imagine you can't protect everything. I imagine that these are things you had to weigh when you were the mayor of Westmount. What do you think the right balance is between protecting heritage and allowing progress when it comes to buildings and architecture?
I think everything has to be taken in context. In the case of Westmount, it has probably the North America's best collection of late Victorian and Edwardian architecture, in that Westmount was essentially built up between 1890 and 1910. So it has a unity of design, a unity of style, a unity of materials. They all, similar materials. So it sort of ties itself together. So if you are going to insert a building or you're going to add to a building in Westmount, we adopted a series of laws back in 1995 that says if you're going to do it, you have to respect what's there. Now, if you're building a building in Brassard, obviously you don't have the same concern because Brassard, we all know, was essentially built from 1975 onwards. So what I'm trying to say is that in the areas of Montreal or Westmount that are distinctly historic, you have to take precautions, and anything you build has to harmonize with what's already there, respect it. because people forget that architecture, like everything else, has fashions. Right now, it's mid-century modern. It's sort of a rehash of the style that was popular in 1950s, and somehow it's enjoying a rebirth. But mid-century modern hates decoration. See? That's one of its characteristics. And so when you come across Victorian or Edwardian architecture that's rich in decoration, a lot of modern architects don't like it. It doesn't meet their particular fashion. My only point is that those architects should remember that in 20 years, mid-century modern will be old-fashioned and nobody will like it anymore. So my point is that if you do have a group of buildings that were all built at the same time, like in Westmount, you must respect the fashion, the architectural fashion of the time. That means a fair amount of decoration, yes. And who knows, as I said, in 20, 30 years, people will love decoration again.
Yeah.
These things are cyclical.
And, it's interesting. And sometimes I look at buildings, for me, the sort of brutalist stuff, the stuff from the 60s and 70s, I can't stand it, and I look at it, I think it's so ugly. And I said to myself, are we going to get back to a time where that becomes de rigueur, where that is, what comes back into fashion? I certainly hope not. But I do think it gets to what we're willing to demolish easily or quickly and what we're not. And sometimes it just comes down to that, subjective preference.
Well, of course, there are people whose specialty is indeed concerning themselves with built heritage, and I'm not saying everything from a period 100, 150 years ago should be preserved. No, I'm not saying that at all. But there are some beautiful examples, and you find them in Westmount because most of Westmount's been untouched, except for the southern part where we stuck in Alexis Neon Plaza, for example. And the less said, the better about that sort of stuff, or indeed the new brutalism that you're talking about. But generally speaking, it has this continuity of style and fashion that I think we should actually preserve. So I'm not the sort of person who says no matter what you do, you cannot touch what's been built before you. Of course not. And indeed, you do have to. I don't like the word progress because it sort of suggests something positive, and quite often progress brings something negative, but that's for another debate.
And maybe for another column. We're with Peter Trent, columnist at the Montreal Gazette, longtime mayor of Westmount. And Peter, sometimes I see new construction, new buildings, and maybe they're in a heritage site, and what they do is they keep one element. They'll keep a column or a beam in order to respect the history. Is that enough at times? What's your take on that?
Yeah,
how we mix
that's called facadism, and it essentially means that you wind up demolishing the entire building except for the facade. And most people who are concerned about heritage don't like that idea. And indeed, I have no use for it because essentially you are pretending you are preserving the building when in fact you're only preserving the frontage. But what I deal with in a column is also when somebody comes along and adds an extremely modern, contemporary addition to an old building. A perfect example is the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto on Bloor Street, where somebody came along and put this sort of crystal excrescence on it. And aside from the fact it looks ugly, they've had water infiltration problems ever since they put it up. So I just find that the most architects who say, well, we should always build of our time, I don't buy that either, because in the past we often did replicate, especially if you're adding to a building that's been there for 200 years, 100 years, and in Britain, of course, they do this all the time. They don't come up with something starkly modern when they're adding to a building. They actually try to have something that blends in. So all to say is I'm not against the current architecture, the current modern architecture. All I'm saying is it should dress itself appropriately when it comes to a ball. And it's not doing that. It tries its best to actually make something in contrast with what is there. If you look at the music faculty building on Sherbrooke Street, for example, the new addition is in the starkly modern style, and I personally have problems with that. I think very rarely does it work.
I have to wrap up here, Peter, but just on the facadism thing, if the alternative is it gets demolished, and it becomes nothing. I'll take the facade. If it turns into a condo behind the scenes, I'm okay with it. If the alternative is it does nothing, it becomes derelict.
Well, I would agree with you. It's certainly better than complete demolition. But all I would say is that we should plan ahead and to just designate those buildings for which you can't demolish the building. And because otherwise, what happens if you don't have these laws? And Montreal has very few of these laws. You have what is called demolition by neglect.
Yes.
The owner intentionally doesn't take care of the building. Look at that fire in Old Montreal.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So then what happens? It gets demolished simply because they've allowed it to become demolished. So we need laws to tell owners, listen, you have a heritage building. You are obliged to keep that building up to snuff. And so it doesn't self-demolish.
Peter, we have to leave it there.
Okay.
Really great column this week in the Gazette. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
That's Peter Trent right there.